That's the only
or maybe
monitor, right?
process as
Yeah, you'd have to look around and say you
unpleasant
might be
as
more.
possible.
Okay.
The current system is
Yeah,
to
but won't
reject as many people as possible. So, do you know, I haven't read all of this, do you know where in the paper they do this? The last thing that they mentioned?
I think this is, yeah, this is the footnote that probably will give you the information about how well it matches up to.
Great. Okay, I want to see exactly what they did. Qualitatively, quantitatively. It doesn't say.
So this sort of strange history thing that way. Okay. ADI, which you guys call so it's back up.
Well, thank you very much for coming today. I think we'll get started. Welcome to all of you to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Andrew Biggs, a resident scholar here at AEI, and I have the privilege of moderating today's session, which is titled, What Can IRS Data Tell Us About Retirement Incomes? When I was thinking about this, I could imagine sort of a B-grade thriller movie that had the tagline that said, what if everything you knew were wrong? This is a slightly modified version of it. The tagline here might be, what if many of the things you know are wrong, and what if many of those are about retirement incomes? It's not something that's quite as thrilling, but it is something which I think is actually very, very important. And I think the fact is that much of what we think we know about retirement incomes, the statistics that drive government policies regarding Social Security and retirement plans, may in fact be wrong. We think we know what retirees' incomes are, what their poverty rates are, how dependent they are on Social Security benefits, and how much they receive from private retirement plans. I can pull some of those statistics from my head. For instance, the poverty rate for Americans over 65 is a little bit under 10%, and about a third of retirees receive almost all of their income from Social Security benefits. Those are the statistics that I know based on the data that's currently used. What we're going to find out today is some of those statistics are wrong because the data that they're based on may be incorrect. In particular, the household survey data that is gathered by the government, which asks people about their sources of income in retirement, systematically understates the incomes that Americans receive from private retirement plans, such as traditional defined benefit pensions, 401ks, IRAs, etc. The result is that we may come to skewed conclusions regarding how well-off retirees are relative to other age groups. We may believe that retirees are becoming dangerously dependent upon Social Security benefits, that private retirement plans have failed, and that retirees today are unable to maintain the standard of living they enjoyed prior to retirement. The two studies being presented today try to come to a more accurate view of retirement incomes by using more accurate data. In the process, they tell a story that, for a policy wonk at least, is close to astonishing. Based on government tax records, the income for the typical retiree household is nearly 1/3 higher than we previously thought. Poverty is substantially lower, and the typical retiree has an income very close to what he or she enjoyed in the years prior to retirement. Quite simply, that's great news. And it shows America's retirement system, which many consider to be an abject failure, in a new light. We don't know what the future will bring in light of increasing lifespans and the decades-long shift from traditional defined benefit pensions to defined contribution plans like 401ks. And these papers don't attempt to make predictions regarding those future outcomes. But more accurate data do seem to show that Americans' retirement incomes would need to drop a great deal further before we could consider our retirement system to be in crisis. I'm very happy today to welcome our two presenters. Our first will be Peter Brady, who's a senior economist in the Retirement and Investor Research Division of the Investment Company Institute. Following Peter will be Joshua Mitchell, who is a senior economist at the U.S. Census Bureau. To both of you, thank you very much for coming and welcome to AEI. But both Pete and Josh are presenting group work. Pete's study is co-authored with Stephen Bass of ICI and Jessica Holland and Kevin Pierce of the Internal Revenue Service. Josh's paper was co-authored with Adam B., who's also of the Census Bureau. We're also privileged to have two very able and distinguished discussants who will offer their comments on Pete and Josh's work. Our first discussant will be Kevin B. Moore, who is chief of the Microeconomic Surveys section in the Research and Statistics Division of the Federal Reserve Board. Our second discussant will be Bruce Meyer, who is the McCormick Foundation professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and a visiting scholar here at AEI. Thank you both for coming today. Following the discussant's comments, we'll allow for a brief interchange between the participants, and then we'll turn to your questions. So at this point, I'd like to begin with our presentations. Pete, we have between 20 and 25 minutes, and then we'll go to Josh. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for showing up today. As Andrew already mentioned, this is a joint work, and my co-authors actually are sitting in the front row. Also want to mention that this paper is a product of the SOI Joint Statistical Research Program. So our paper examines two questions. First, are workers able to maintain their standard of living after they claim Social Security benefits? To answer that question, what we're going to look at is changes in spendable income around the time they claim. Secondly, where do retirees get their income from after they claim Social Security? And to answer that question, we're going to look at the incidence and amounts of income they get from different sources. So the reason we undertook this research is that the Social Security system and tax deferral for retirement plans are important components of the U.S. tax and transfer system. And together they generate most of the income that retirees rely on. And so it's very important for policymakers and for administrators to understand how these programs are working. It's particularly important because there are many proposals to change one or both of these programs, and a lot of these proposals are premised on the idea that there's a retirement crisis. That is, that workers are not accumulating enough resources while they're working to maintain their standard of living after they retire. Well, what do we find? Well, we find that actually most are able to maintain their inflation-adjusted net income after they retire, and the individuals who are the lowest income when we first observe them tend to replace the highest percentage of that income. What we find on where do they get their income? Well, in addition to Social Security, it turns out that most that we observe in the data have income from pensions, annuities, and IRAs, okay, what we refer to as retirement income. And indeed, most in the sample are going to rely on a mix of both Social Security benefits and this retirement income. So the plan for today is I'm going to describe a little bit of the data. I'm going to look at how spendable income changes in retirement. Then I'm going to, or after claiming Social Security, then I'm going to look at where individuals get their income from. And then a brief discussion on if we can discern where the pension and annuity income is, what is generating that income. Okay, so the data we use is a panel data set. It's a 1999 to 2010 panel. It starts with a representative sample of all taxpayers in 1999. It's going to, and we're going to look at all individuals who are either a primary or secondary taxpayer in a joint return or a primary taxpayer on a non-joint return. And then we're going to follow all those individuals through 2010. What we want to do is we want to observe them before they claim Social Security. We want to observe them claiming, and then look at what happens after that claiming incident. So what we're going to focus on are people who are age 55 to 61 in 1999, just below the early retirement claiming age, who are working and have not yet claimed, or not yet receiving any Social Security benefits. Okay? And then what we want to look at is what happens after they claim Social Security. One nice thing about focusing on this particular group is that the tax data appear to be representative of the group we're studying. Okay, so if you look at all individuals age 55 to 61, and you compare the number in the tax returns, the number in the population counts, over 95% file a tax return. And when you look at what we're looking at, which are those who are still working and haven't claimed Social Security, the percentage is closer to 100%. So we think most of the people who we want to look at are going to be in the tax data 99. And then they do not need to, although you have to file a tax return 99, you don't have to file a tax return in later years to stay in the sample. The reason is we can measure your income using information returns. That is, we grab wages and salary from the W-2, we grab Social Security benefits from the Form SSA 1099, and we grab pension, annuity, and IRA distributions from the Form 1099-R. Okay, so we're going to, we define the first year we see you receiving Social Security income as a claiming year. and we refer to that, as economists are wont to do, as year T. And then we're going to look at the 5-year period starting 1 year before you claim and extending out to 3 years after the year you claim. When we rank individuals, we're going to always rank them by their 99 income, so which is when they're all working and before any of the claimed Social Security. The income we may be measuring in the tables we're showing you can be from as late as 2010, but we're always going to rank individuals by their 99 income when we show the income results. All right, so there's 12.5 million people that in the tax data that meet our criterion of being 55 to 61 and 99, working and not having Social Security benefits. What we're going to analyze is the 59% who claim between 2000 and 2007. And the reason is we would need to observe their data 3 years after they claim. What that excludes are about 19% who are going to claim who we observed claiming in 2008, 9, and 10. About 5% who claim Social Security disability benefits before they claim Social Security retirement benefits. About 13% who were alive in 2010 and had not yet claimed benefits, and 4% who died before we observed them receiving the income. Now note, for those who haven't received it or who died before they received it, we don't actually know if they were eligible to receive the benefits. They may have been covered by a government plan, or they may not have had enough credits to qualify. Okay, so I went through a lot of slides pretty quickly. This slide pretty much summarizes all you need to know to go forward in the presentation. Namely, we're looking at people close to the early retirement age, that are early retirement claiming age, that are working and don't have Social Security income, and then we're going to follow them out, follow anyone who claims between 2000 and 2007. Okay, so we can turn to our first question: what happens to spendable income? So many studies of retirement will focus on how much of people's income or how much of people's earnings they can replace in retirement. But economic theory suggests that people don't have a goal of replacing income or replacing earnings. In sort of English, what they want to do is maintain their standard of living. So at most, what that would mean is they want to maintain how much spending they have in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms. Although it's also possible that they may be able to maintain their standard of living even if spending declines. So what we're going to look at, we can't measure spending in our data, but we're going to look at spendable income. And what we mean by spendable income is simply what people have left over after they have saved and paid their taxes. Now, the tax data do not allow us to measure, accurately measure savings as a whole, but we can directly measure retirement plan contributions, and we can measure payroll taxes and federal income taxes. Now, the results I'm going to show you today, I'm going to focus on what we call work-related income. Now, what work-related income includes is, of course, labor income, that is wages and salaries from work, but it also includes income from two other sources that ultimately are generated by working, and that's Social Security benefits and distributions from pensions, annuities, and IRAs. And what it's going to exclude is basically other income, taxable income, investment income and taxable accounts, rents, royalties, business income, farm income, et cetera. And since we're focused on work-related income, our measure of spendable income is going to be net work-related income. Okay, so the next few slides, what I'm going to show you are what happens to mean spendable income around the time of claiming. Recall that year T is the year in which we observe people claim Social Security benefits, and it can be anywhere from 2000 to 2007. And then we look at years around that. The income measures are all inflation adjusted, and they are also per capita, which means that for a married couple on a joint return, we split all the income equally. Okay? So what this slide shows is that most people are able to maintain their spendable income per person after retirement. Total work-related income actually declines by about $4,400 between T minus 1 and T plus 3, but taxes decline by $3,600. So on net, what you see is that spendable income, the blue portion of the bars, stays roughly constant over the time. So in the next few slides, what we're going to look at is how this differs by individuals' 1999 income. So what we see is that for those who are in the lowest 20%, the bottom quintile of 1999 income, they actually experience, on average, a 29% increase in spendable income. For those in the middle quintile, for those in the middle quintile, this is about, income stays about flat, and you don't start observing declines in average income until you get to higher income individuals. In this case, we're showing the 80th to 95th percentile. Now, about half of the individuals in the sample are still working 3 years after claiming Social Security. So what the next two slides look at is whether work status affects these results. And what you see is that a bigger increase for the lowest quintile. They actually experience a 43% increase in spendable income. For the middle quintile of workers who continue to work, their income, their net spendable income is about constant. And you see a decline at the top, but it's a fairly modest decline. If we then look at what happens to those who aren't working 3 years later, the lower income actually still have an increase in spendable income, average spendable income, but it's much more modest, 11%. We still see income in the middle stay about constant, and spendable income at the top declines pretty substantially for higher income who no longer work. Okay, so that shows us the mean on average, gives you an idea of what's happening, but of course there's a wide variation among people that the means can mask. And so to look at how things vary and what the different experiences of people are, we actually calculate for every individual in the sample a replacement rate. And the replacement rate we're looking at is, again, a replacement of spendable income, not gross income. And in particular, we're focused on net work-related income. So in all these, all the replacement rates I'm going to show you in the next few slides, and we'll go somewhat quickly, is the denominator is always going to be spendable income in year T-1, the year before they claim, and then we're going to look at how that relates to income in later years. The next few slides are going to show the distribution of results among everyone in the sample. The blue box is going to be the median. So, for example, among everyone in our sample in the first year, in the year they claim Social Security, the median replacement rate of spendable income is 106%. The green dots represent the 25th and 75th percentile, meaning 25% have a replacement rate of 88 or lower, and 25% have a replacement rate of 126 or higher. And then we also show the 10th and 90th. Now, if you go out through T+3, the median stays fairly constant, although there's a slight increase in the spread of results. So what I want to focus is, again, on year T+3, but I'm going to look at it by income. Okay, so it's the same slide. We're going to do it by income. And what you see is for the bottom 60% up through the middle quintile of 99 income, replacement rates on average, the median is over 100%. The other thing you see is that there's a general decline. That is, 99 income increases the replacement rate, and the whole distribution tends to shift down. Okay? Again, about half of individuals are working 3 years later, so we want to see how whether working and not working affects results. And what you can see is that for those who are, this shows those who are working 3 years after claiming Social Security, and what you can see is they have a higher replacement rate, and the way you can see that is that the entire distribution tends to shift up. Okay, so if you compare the average and you look at those who are working, it tends to shift up. But again, you see the pattern where the highest replacement rates tend to be at the bottom, and then it slowly goes down. Those who aren't working 3 years later tend to have lower replacement rates, and you can see that because the entire distribution of these replacement rates are shifting down. Again, the general pattern is people lower 99 income tend to have higher replacement rates, but in particular, lowest is over 100%. Okay, so we find that most people, on average, are going to maintain their inflation-adjusted spending, and the lower income and those who were working 3 years later tend to have higher replacement rates. So now we can turn to the second question, which is where do people get their income from? And for that, we're going to look at incidence and amounts of income from different sources. What this slide illustrates is that retirement is really best thought of as a transitional period instead of a point in time. Okay? So what we see from this slide, if you look at the left, is that even a year before they claim Social Security, about 15% of those in our sample have stopped working. And the share who are working continues to decline until 3 years later, although nearly half are still working 3 years later, and 61% are either working or have a spouse who's working. Okay, so this is a slow transitional period. What you also see is as the amount of people working declines, the amount of people who have income from pensions, annuities, and IRAs increase. So even the year before they claim Social Security, nearly half of individuals have income from these sources, and that increases to 72% 3 years after they claim. And this income tends to be persistent in that of the 67% who claim in the first year, about 92% of them claim in all 3 years after claiming Social Security. So in the next few slides, I'm going to focus on the 3 years after claiming, the T1 through T+3, and now I'm going to again look at it by 99 income and see what the pattern is. So what we see here is that for a large portion of the middle or upper part, so from the 40th percentile to the 95th percentile, 45% sort of in the middle to the upper middle, by the third year, nearly 85% have this income. The lowest incidence we see is both in the top 5% and the lower 40%. If we extend this analysis out to the full 5-year period and say how many people received the income in at least one of the 5 years from 1 year before to 3 years later, we get that 81% receive income from these sources. In addition, we have evidence that some of the people who never received pension income actually have some of these resources. In particular, we can observe someone who had a 1099-R but didn't have any pension income. And when would that happen? That's like a rollover to an IRA. They got a distribution, but they rolled it over, didn't create any income. Or we could see that they have a Form 5498, which shows that they have an IRA, but they're not yet drawing down income. And what you can see is that the highest income are much more likely to have the resources but not yet be drawing them down. So the upshot of this slide is that if you're 55 to 61 and 99 and you're not in the bottom quintile of income, which means you have per capita income of about $17,000, which would be about $24,000 in today's term, you have a really good chance of having some of these, having these resources. Nearly everybody at the top has these. Okay. So that tells you they have them, how important it is. Well, to look at how important it is, what I want to look at is for everybody non-labor income, I want to remove labor income because some are working and some aren't working, and just look at where the non-labor income comes from. So, and we're going to do it by their 99 income. So what this shows is that Social Security benefits are a much portion of non-labor income for people who with lower income in 99, much smaller portion of at the high end, and this actually reflects the design of the benefit. This is the benefit formula. It's designed to replace a higher percent of earnings at the low end, lower percentages as income goes up. Income from pensions, annuity, and IRAs has the opposite pattern in that it's not as important at the low end, but it tends to increase in importance going up. And what you actually see is for the people in the middle quintile, the magnitude is on par with Social Security benefits that they're getting. And then we don't really talk about the other income, but the wealthy are not like you or I. They have non-labor, non-work-related income of different types. Okay, so that shows on average where people are getting the income. Of course, there could be lots of variation. And again, what we're going to show you is what we calculate is for each individual, we're going to calculate their income shares. What percentage of their income, and this is total income, including all sources of income and before taxes, what percentage it comes from different sources. And what you see for the sample as a whole, luckily for a sample design, those who haven't claimed Social Security, the median amount they get is 0. Now there are some people with some Social Security benefits in there because they may have a spouse that had already claimed Social Security, and that's included in the income. As they claim, the percentage of income they get from Social Security increases, and it's about, median is about 43%, but there's a wide variation. 10% of the sample only has Social Security benefits in year T+3. If we look at retirement income, we still see at the median there's very little retirement income the year before they claim Social Security, although again, about half of people are getting this income before they claim, so there are some with a higher percentage from there. And as you go out to year T+3, the median is about 33%. So what that shows is for, so again, we're going to look at your T+3 and see how, so this 43% and 33% bars, we're going to look at how that varies by income. And what you see is for the lowest 20% of 99 income, on average, they get a lot of their income from Social Security. So the median is 77%, 25% get only Social Security benefits. Okay, so the 75th percentile is at 100. Very few are going to be getting retirement benefits. The median amount is 0. Although there are some people with retirement benefits. If you go up the income distribution, and I don't include the highest income, you again see the pattern where Social Security becomes less important and retirement income becomes more important. For the middle quintile of income, again, the median amount they get from Social Security and the median amount from retirement income are very similar. Oops, I went slide too many. Okay. So again, these results were the most surprising results of the studies. This is not what we expected when we went into the study. It was not what I thought I knew. As Andrew said, I thought I knew where people were getting their income. And what we find is this income is very widespread. Nearly 9 in 10 have evidence of having resources from this. It's persistent, and it tends to be a substantial, on par for the middle income people with what they're getting from Social Security. Although there is definitely a grading on this, but that's reflecting the design of the Social Security system. Certainly the lower income are going to rely more on Social Security, and the higher income are going to rely more on the retirement income. Okay, so those are the two questions we set out to answer. However, our research has tended to prompt others to ask us questions that we are not necessarily well inclined to answer, but I'm going to take it on. And the question we often get is, well, this pension annuity income, where's it coming from? Okay, and again, part of the interest is this shift from DB plans to DC plans in the private sector. And so there's a big concern about how much this is coming from private sector DB plans. Now, it turns out the tax data aren't well designed to answer this question, because from a tax perspective, it's really not relevant where the income is. It's all taxed the same and has the same tax treatment. So for example, on the Form 1040, what we know, we have two categories. One, we know if it's a distribution from an IRA, and two, we know it comes from a pension or annuity. That's all we know. It's difficult to identify the original source of this income, not only because in general we don't really know whether it's pension or annuity, or whether it's a DB pension or a DC pension, but also because we really don't know where the IRA money is coming from. So IRAs accept rollovers from all sorts of plans. They accept it from lump sum payments from DB plans or DC plans, payments from government plans or from private sector plans. So we really don't know the actual origin of that data. So, but we use two methods, and we don't think either provides any good point estimates, but what it helps is sort of bound. How much do we think might be, is the maximum amount we can say might be coming from private sector pensions? Joshua, in their paper, they do another attempt to try to get at this, even though we don't have any direct measures of it. So what we're going to look at, the first thing we looked at was in our panel data set. And we want to look at people who had pension income in 2 consecutive years and see how consistent that was. Okay? And in this chart, what I'm going to show you is people who had pension income in both the 3rd year after claiming and the 2nd year after claiming, so 2nd and 3rd year. And our supposition is, well, if people tend to have about the same amount, so it's around 100% in both years, that might indicate it's a private sector pension, because most of those are fixed in nominal terms and they pay the same amount each year. If they show a slight increase, say 101 to 105%, then that might be an indication it's a government plan, because a lot of the federal plan and many state and local plans have cost of living increases every year. And so when we looked at it and we looked at pension annuity income, what we found as far as percentage of individuals and percentage of dollars, that about a third of the income that we're seeing in the pension annuity falls into this category of near 100%. And another 29% falls into this category of 101 to 105. So these are potentially private sector DBs and public sector DBs. To test it, we looked at what about people who receive IRA income in 2 years. And what that shows is that this 101 to 105 may be a good way to identify people getting government DBs, but it turns out people who have control over their accounts and have accounts and take regular payments sometimes like getting the same amount each year, at least as some fraction of them do that. So we're not completely sure if this 33% is all going to be a private sector DC, or DB, but if it was, what we can say is about a third of the pension annuity income and about a quarter of all the retirement income that we're observing in T+3 is coming from this source. Another way to look at it is to look at some aggregate data, and this is from research that we're in the process of writing up, and analysis we've done using cross-sectional data. Okay? So this is 2010 data, and what we know is that from the tax data is that we know in 2010 we measured total gross distributions from pensions, annuity, and IRAs at about 1.2 trillion. Nearly 400 billion of that, however, are just transfers from one account to another, that leaves about a little over 800 billion in net distributions. So the question is, can we identify what percentage of that 827 is coming from private sector pensions, or at least put a bound on it? So one way to do it is first start by looking at gross distributions. And we know from the tax data that about 24% of this is IRAs, and the rest is going to be pensions and annuities. And then we can go to the aggregate data from the Form 5500 or other sources of aggregate data, and we can see that about 61% of the pension of this is from, that we can identify as being from a DB or DC pension, including DC plans, inclusive of private sector DC plans in the TSP, private sector DB plans, governmental DB plans. What's in the other 15%? Well, we don't know. If we did, we'd tell you. But what we can tell by looking at other data is that a substantial portion of this is going to be actually distributions from non-qualified annuities. Okay? These are reported on the same line. Okay? Now, we can take some of the transfers out of specific items over there. So Roth conversions are generally going to come out of IRAs, rollovers from pensions, but we don't know what type of pension, and we can get down to these net numbers. Okay, so almost done here. So what's the bottom line? So we want to know what of that 827 could possibly be coming from traditional DB plans. Well, we start with 170 that's coming out of private sector DB plans, but we can't use that full number because about 54 billion is actually coming from cash balance plans, which are often called hybrid plans. And so only about 116 billion are coming from more traditional defined benefit plans. And if all that income was taken out, none of it was lump sum distribution rolled to an IRA, then we would get about 14% of net distributions we're measuring in 2010 coming from the private sector pensions. So again, this is something that unfortunately it's very much of interest to many in the policy community. It's not important for filing taxes or determining your tax liability, so it's not something we can measure well with tax data, but we can try to put some bounds on it. Okay, so to summarize, our main findings is what we find is that most people are able to maintain their standard of living, their spendable income after they claim Social Security benefits. And those who we observe in 99 that have the lowest income tend to have the highest replacement rates. And we just find, again, a surprising amount of retirement income. It's widespread and it's persistent and it seems to be substantial.
Thank you very much, Pete, and right on time. Our next presenter this morning will be Josh Mitchell of the Census Bureau, presenting joint work that he conducted with Adam B.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for inviting us. The views expressed today are mine and Adam's and not necessarily those of the U.S. Census Bureau.
I forgot to mention that, yes.
So the motivation for this talk broadly is the most important question in retirement policy, which is, are Americans saving enough for retirement? Are they in danger of running out of money at older ages? And there's a variety of studies that use different assumptions and methods that come to starkly different conclusions to this important question. But one thing they nearly all have in common, with the exception of Pete's just released paper, is they rely on one of a few popular household surveys to do their analysis. Now, there's some long-standing data quality concerns with income data in household surveys. And in particular, if you take a measure of income from a survey and aggregate it up and compare it to one of a few outside sources, such as the National Income and Product Accounts or tax data or other administrative records, which I've labeled as ADREC, you see that the survey falls short of the outside target. Now, the key point is that by themselves, these aggregate discrepancies can't tell us a whole lot. It could be, on the one hand, that there's a few wealthy households who are missing from the survey or who aren't reporting their income, in which case the distributional statistics are largely unaffected. On the other hand, it could be that if you found this missing income and you put it back in the survey, it would broadly alter our understanding of living standards, in this case for the older population. And so the purpose of this paper is to answer that question. And so we do that by linking our survey, census survey, at the microdata level so that we can compare the administrative records and the survey responses on a person-by-person basis. And this is going to allow us to do distributional analysis. In particular, we're going to develop new nationally representative estimates of median household income and poverty for the population 65 and older through 2012. We're then going to step back and ask which of the administrative record data sources we use are most important for our findings, and this is going to have implications for the importance of DB versus DC income, the relative importance of Social Security income, and we'll do a little bit of transition to retirement analysis as well. So the primary data source for this project is the U.S. Census Bureau's 2013 Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement. And this is, in 2013, they asked about your income for the previous year, so 2012. And it's the source for the official 2012 income and poverty report numbers. We have about 15,000 households with a householder 65 and older. And in-house, we have a process that assigns a protected identification key or a PIC to about 90% of the sample, and that allows us to link from the survey to these other administrative record data sources. I'm going to focus today on validating 5 types of income that are important for older Americans. The first is earnings, both from wages and self-employment, then Social Security benefits, SSI, dividends and interest, and what we call retirement income, which is apart from Social Security, all the retirement income, survivor income, disability income. You can think of it broadly as DB and DC income. Now, the CPS has longstanding had a focus on a money income concept, which can be defined as a stream of regular payments. And that fits very nicely with traditional defined benefit plans, which typically paid an annuity upon retirement. But as there's been a shift from DB plans to DC, many retirees take their withdrawals from DC plans on an irregular or as-needed basis rather than regular basis. And so that has led many outside analysts to raise concerns that the CPS was missing lots of DC income. There's also lots of complicated other types of withdrawals, such as lump sums, rollovers, and this poses a challenge to the CPS. How should we think about measuring these? So in 2014, the CPS actually underwent a major redesign designed to address some of these questions. And they added specific questions about retirement account withdrawals and addressed some of the underreporting of asset income. And my colleagues at the Census Bureau evaluated the redesign and found a modest boost in incomes for the 2014 data. Now, we don't have the administrative records for 2014, so everything we do today is going to be through the 2013 survey, and we're going to be focusing just on the traditional CPS questions. So in particular, the main CPS retirement question asks, in the previous year, did you or anyone in your household receive any pension or retirement income from a previous employer or union, or any other type of retirement income apart from Social Security or VA benefits, which are questions that are asked earlier in the interview? And if you say yes, we ask who received it, the amounts, and also what the source was. And if you could look at option number 7, you can see this language of regular payments from IRAs, 401ks, et cetera. And it's that language that has led many outside analysts to raise concerns that most of the DC income would not be counted based on this definition. So that's the survey. We then link the CPS to several different administrative record sources, 3 of which we obtained from the Social Security Administration. So in particular, we get your earnings information from your W-2s and your self-employment information from your Schedule SEs. We also get your monthly Social Security benefit amounts, including your deductions for your Medicare premiums, as well as your monthly SSI benefits, both your federal amounts and your state supplements. From the IRS, we also obtain 2 data sources. One is the Form 1040. We have very limited fields from the 1040, so for today we're just using the dividend income as well as the taxable and tax-exempt interest amounts from the 1040. There's an additional complication with a 1040 because it's a return, not necessarily an individual, so you have to make an assumption about who's getting the asset income and also what to do about non-filers. We split the asset income for joint filers, and it's not going to matter too much because we aggregate back up to the family or household level anyways. For non-filers, we just continue to use the survey values for interest and dividends. And then lastly, but most consequentially, we have this Form 1099-R, which Pete's already talked about, but this is the gross distributions from pensions, annuities, retirement or profit-sharing plans, IRAs, et cetera. And this you can think of broadly as capturing all the defined benefit income and defined contribution withdrawals, and it's an information return, so you get one even if you do not file a 1040 in the given year. Now, importantly, the file we obtain at Census includes certain types of 1099-R distributions and excludes others. So in particular, we receive early distributions, normal distributions, disability and death distributions, but we exclude certain distributions we would not wish to consider income, including direct rollovers and conversions and recharacterizations, which really is more about moving money from one tax-preferred account to another. We want to aim to focus on measuring the withdrawals once when they leave the tax-preferred universe for good. So what we do is we take our survey and we merge on the PIC to all these different administrative record data sources to measure income at the person level. If you are one of the people in the CPS without a PIC, we continue just to use your survey values. And outside of these 5 sources that we're validating, we just use the CPS values. We then aggregate back up to the family or household level as needed. So as a first result, we compare aggregates between the CPS as a percent of the administrative record data source for 2 age groups, those 18 to 64 and those age 65 and older. And you can see that for earnings, the CPS is capturing nearly 100% of earnings for both groups. For Social Security benefits, it also captures a very high fraction, particularly for those age 65 and older. For SSI, things are a little bit more complex for younger workers. They're often reporting SSI on behalf of their children. When you look at the older population, which is the focus of this paper, we're getting about 70% of SSI benefits. When we get to interest and dividends, we're only capturing about 60% for the older population. And then when you get to retirement income, we're most strikingly only capturing about 45%. And when you put these 5 sources together, for working age people, we're still getting about 95% of the total income because earnings so dominates for that group. But when you look at age 65 and older, you can see that we're missing about a quarter of the income for that group. So that's the aggregates, but the key point of our paper is that we can look at the distributional implications of this missing income. So in particular, we're going to produce statistics that are similar to those produced in the annual income and poverty report, median household income for householders 65 and older, and poverty rates for persons 65 and older. Poverty is defined as your family income compared to the relevant threshold, which varies based on your family size. I will show the results for 3 groups: the full CPS sample, which just replicates the official numbers, the subset who are picked, and then finally the ADREC sample, which is the same as the PIC sample, except we've swapped out the survey values and replaced them with the administrative records and recalculated. So in 2012, the official median household income for householders 65 and older was $33,800. Looking at the subset with PICs, it's essentially the same at $34,000. When we replace the survey values with the administrative records and recalculate, we find instead that the median household income was $44,000. So it's $10,000 more, it's about a 30% difference, so quite substantial. I don't have time to go into all the results by demographic subgroups, but I will quickly flip through and demonstrate that there are large differences among most of the demographic subgroups examined. So in particular, if we look at householders 65 to 74, we see a large difference. If we look at householders 75 to 84, we again see a large difference. And even for the oldest householders, we see a large difference in percentage terms. If we look at family householders, we see large differences. Non-family householders, large differences. College graduate householders, large differences. Those with some college, large differences. High school graduate householders, large differences. And even there's something there for those with less than a high school degree. We see it for white householders, black householders, Asian householders, Hispanic householders. So very pervasive across the socioeconomic distribution. We also did some comparisons to outside data sources, in particular the Fed Bulletin, which is based on the Survey of Consumer Finances. And that survey has, as its focus, collection of detailed wealth information and has a more expansive definition of income, but counts these irregular withdrawals. And it generally does show higher income than the CPS. When we do the comparison, however, while the SEF is higher than the CPS, we still find that the administrative records are about 15% higher than the SCF for householders 65 and older, and there's also a difference there for householders 75 and older. That's the middle of the distribution. Can these results possibly affect the poverty rate? So in 2012, the official poverty rate for persons 65 and older was 9.1%. For the PIC sample, it's 9%. When we replace the survey values with the administrative records and recalculate, it falls by over 2 points, so at 6.9%. Again, these findings are pervasive across age subgroups. So in particular, you see a large difference for 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 85 and older. And one interesting thing is that in the survey, you see a very high age gradient in poverty rates of about 4 points, whereas in the administrative records, the total gap between the youngest of the aged and the oldest is only about 1 point. So that analysis replaced all the administrative records at once. A natural follow-up question is which of the administrative records data sources is driving our results. So we're going to examine this across the household income distribution, replacing one of these data sources at a time in a cumulative fashion and recalculate. So this just shows the baseline. When I first swap out the survey earnings and replace with the administrative records, we see that the red is essentially on top of the blue. Earnings are very well correspond between the two data sources. When we next swap out Social Security income, again, throughout most of the distribution, things look pretty good. There's actually some evidence of over-reporting of Social Security at the bottom. That turns out to be confusion among survey respondents between Social Security and the SSI program. So when we also swap out SSI, that over-reporting goes away, and again, things look pretty good throughout most of the distribution. When we next swap out interest and dividends, we start to see a greater divergence, particularly in the middle of the distribution. And then lastly, when we replace the retirement income, we see this dramatic picture getting to the 30% at the median, but also large differences throughout most of the household income distribution. So I want to pause for a minute and discuss some potential issues that can be raised about these results. Everything we've done has taken the administrative records as the truth and has compared it to the survey. You could raise questions about the quality of the administrative records, and we do a lot in the paper to validate our administrative record data against outside tabulations. But in general, we think the tax data are of high quality, and there really isn't an incentive for individuals or third parties to over-report their retirement income to the IRS, because of course that would trigger additional tax liability. With respect to another issue you could raise is the quality of the linkage between the survey and the administrative records. Again, we use the same linkage process for all the administrative records. We're finding very close correspondence for earnings and Social Security benefits, so we don't think that the data linkage is an issue. And then the last issue that could be raised is that you can acknowledge that these resources are there, but some people do not wish to count these or do not view these as measures of pure income. That's a fair point, but we do note that in a world where we're transitioning from defined benefit to defined contribution, if you sort of count the defined benefit income but don't count the DC, you're going to get a perhaps distorted picture, and it's also not going to distinguish between two individuals, one who's solely has Social Security income and nothing else, and one who has Social Security income and is also making substantial irregular withdrawals from a DC. Do we feel comfortable classifying them as having the same living standard? So I leave that question to you. So the next, we examined the nature of underreporting in the survey and the administrative records for the different income sources. And first, at the intensive margin, we looked at people who both reported something in the survey and who had it in the administrative records. And while earnings has the highest correlation, we actually see fairly strong correlations for all the data sources. And in particular, retirement income is not badly reported relative to, say, Social Security income. So if you report retirement income, things look pretty good. On the other hand, if you look at whether people say they have any of that type of income, for Social Security, there's a very close correspondence of about 85% in both data sources. But when we look instead at retirement income, we see that only 37% say they have any in the CPS, whereas 61% have it according to the administrative records. And if you break down that 61%, it's about 50% have employer-sponsored distributions, and 29% have IRAs, 61% having either of those. So next, we do a lot of work in the paper asking what explains this retirement income underreporting. And so we through every demographic variable we could at this problem, but we can only explain about 5% of the variation in false negative rates. We also looked at a variety of survey design features that might potentially cause this, such as whether you are the respondent, whether your observation was imputed, what month and sample you were. And again, we explained very little of the variation in underreporting based on these variables. We also, in a supplementary analysis, linked the retirement income 1099-R forms to the American Community Survey, which is a very different animal where there's no interviewer, it's a mandatory survey. And again, we get a very similar rate of underreporting in the ACS as the CPS. So it's hard to pin it down on something that is specific to the CPS. We get the most traction in terms of the nature of the 1099-R income itself. In particular, the false negative rates are very high for those who only have IRA distributions, but they're still fairly high for those with employer-sponsored distributions. We also showed that if you have a large amount of retirement income, you're more likely to report something in the CPS, but again, even with large amounts, there's a fairly high rate of underreporting. And also those who have more volatile distributions between one year and the next are less likely to report something in the survey. Now, another issue that can be raised is whether this retirement income is a one-time event, in which case we might be distorting our picture of living standards, or are these really regular recurring payments? So we look at those who received retirement income in 2012, and we asked what fraction of them also received a distribution the next year, and what was the degree of fluctuation between the 2 years, both for employer-sponsored and IRAs. And we can see that for young people, it's actually a one-off event. It's not that common to have a distribution in consecutive years. But once you get to 65 and older, it's close to 100% have an employer-sponsored distribution in 2013 if they had one in 2012. When we look at the fluctuation in amounts, those who have a drop greater than 10%, those who have a small change within 10%, and those who have an increase greater than 10%. Again, once you get to 65 and older, people either have a steady change, or if they do have a larger change, they're just as likely to have an increase or as a decrease. So overall, a very high fraction have either a small change or an increase. We look at IRAs, again, for 65 and older, you're very likely to have an IRA distribution in 2013 if you had one in 2012. In part, that's because of the required minimum distribution rules, which mandate that you take distributions after age 70.5. But when we do look at the amounts, there's considerable more volatility with IRA distributions. For example, for 75 to 84, only about half have a small change in IRA amount, but we can see that if anything, when they have a large change, they're more likely to have an increase in the next year than a large decrease. So given that our results from the beginning of the presentation were so pervasive across the socioeconomic distribution, and there even for the oldest retirees, we wanted to raise the question of whether the underreporting was not simply the IRAs and other DC income, but whether defined benefit income was also missing from the CPS. And we did this analysis by looking at those in the CPS who linked to a 1099-R from one of a few specific government retirement plans. These are traditional DB plans, so by anyone's definition, this should be counted as money income. And in particular, we're going to be looking at those who have one from the Federal Civil Service Retirement System, the Military Retirement Fund, or CalPERS, one of the largest state DB plans. And we can see that for those 65 and older, in terms of having any employer-sponsored distribution, about 35% say, I have nothing in the CPS. Now, things are better for these specific government plans, but there's still a substantial fraction who are reporting zero retirement income in the CPS. In particular, 25% for the Federal Civil Service Retirement System, 20% for the Military Retirement Fund, and 15% for CalPERS say they have zero even though they are receiving these 1099-Rs. Next, we wanted to examine how this boost in retirement income is going to change our understanding of the relative importance of different income sources across the income distribution. And so we used as our benchmark a publication put out every few years by the Social Security Administration, the Income with the Age chart book, that's actually based on the current population survey data. They use as their unit of analysis an aged unit, which they define as either an unmarried person 65 and older, or a married couple with a husband 65 and older. And we're going to ask how the boost of retirement income affects the relative importance of all income sources. So in particular, if I take your aged units and I rank them by their administrative record income and group them into deciles, we can see that your Social Security receipt rate between the survey and administrative records correspond very closely. And in terms of amounts, again, we get pretty similar amounts across most of the distribution. In contrast, when we look at retirement income, for example, in the fifth decile, in the CPS, 48% of aged units have some retirement income, whereas according to the administrative records, it's 82%. So quite a big difference. When we break that administrative record amount into the various subcomponents, we do an analysis like Pete did based on whether we think your distribution is defined benefit, employer DC, or IRA. If we look at the fifth decile, we see that about 65% have some DB income, and about 35% have some IRA income. Only a small fraction have direct distribution from employer DC account. Most of that would have been rolled over, and we would see it when it comes out as an IRA distribution. When we look at amounts of retirement income, of course, they're quite skewed. You can see large amounts for the top decile, but even in the fifth decile, you can see that the average amount is about $10,000, of which about $7,500 we estimate is defined benefit income. This graph is done purely based on the survey, so you could do this at home if you'd like. But basically, we're showing the shares of income across the income distribution, and the big orange blob is the Social Security share, the dark blue is the retirement income share. You can see for the bottom decile, it's 69% Social Security, and the average share in the fifth decile is 72%. When we do the same picture with the administrative records, we see that that share falls in the bottom decile to 55% and falls in the fifth decile to 53%. At the bottom decile, again, this is misclassification mostly between Social Security and SSI. That gray area got bigger. Whereas at the fifth decile, you see that retirement income share went up and Social Security's income share went down. Unlike the bottom decile in the middle of the distribution, this isn't simply a misclassification of dollars. This is actually a 30% higher income in the middle of the distribution. At the top, Social Security's share stays about the same. The boost in the retirement income share comes at the expense of actually the earnings share. Again, when we break down the type of retirement income you have across the distribution, we see that retirement income overall is about 30% in the middle of the distribution, and we're getting that 22% of your overall income is DB. So about 3/4 of your retirement income in the middle of the distribution is DB as of 2012. Now, this change in the shares is going to affect some often cited statistics on the percent of Social Security beneficiaries where Social Security is at least half their income. So in particular, if you use the CPS by itself, you get that about 2/3 rely on Social Security for 50% of their income, whereas with the administrative records, it's about half. More strikingly, when we look at the 90% threshold, we see that the fraction that rely on Social Security for at least 90% of the income falls in half from 36% to 18%. Now, everything I showed you so far was using income data from 2012, but we actually linked the CPS to many years of archived administrative records, and we're able to extend our analysis back a quarter century, so to look at trends in median income and poverty rates. And in particular, you can see that even in 1990, there is a discrepancy of about 20% between the CPS and the administrative records. That grows to 30% in 2012. And what that means is that while median incomes grew 18% according to the survey, they grew 29% if you used the linked data. In terms of poverty rates, the trends in poverty rates are largely unaffected by this, but in every year you have a downward shift of over 2 points between the CPS and the linked data. And one final graph is showing the trends over time in retirement income receipt. We can see that at the beginning of the series, the two are only a little bit apart between the CPS and the linked data, and of course they diverge to the 61-36 difference in 2012. So remarkably, according to the CPS, there's been no increase at all in retirement income receipt, whereas we see a big increase over time in the administrative records. Lastly, I'll go very quickly through this, but we examined the retirement transition, similar to what Pete has done, and we asked the question both in terms of a relative metric, how well are pre-retirement living standards maintained, as well as an absolute metric, do we observe any increases in poverty? Unlike Pete's analysis, we don't have a panel. We're using a synthetic cohort approach, which means we pool many of these linked samples together, and we're examining similar individuals across years. And the reason we do that is that's the only way to compare the survey measure and the administrative record measure across time. So these are just some details of the analysis. We're looking at those who claim Social Security between 2003 and 2007. And what we can see here is we do the results separately for men and women. Again, years surrounding the claim of Social Security. According to the CPS, you see the decline in income, median incomes in blue. When we look at the same thing for the administrative records, again, prior to claiming Social Security, the two lines are essentially on top of each other. After claiming, when retirement income becomes more prevalent for men, you see this divergence here, and there's much less of an evidence of a decline post-claiming Social Security when using the administrative records. When we look for women, we also see less evidence of a decline, although the divergence happens earlier for women because, in fact, they often receive retirement income prior to claiming Social Security. If we look at absolute measures such as poverty rates, we don't see much evidence of poverty rising in either series with lower poverty rates in the administrative records. When we look at higher thresholds such as 200% of poverty or 300% of poverty, again, things look pretty similar for men prior to claiming Social Security, but there's a very large divergence after claiming. Again, this is mostly due to retirement income. For women, the divergence happens earlier, again, because they're receiving retirement income prior to claiming. So just to summarize that, incomes fall much more in the survey than in the administrative records. And when there are income declines, they start several years prior to claiming. There isn't an abrupt change at retirement. We also don't see any evidence for men or women that poverty rates rise in either series. And in most cases, when there is a rise in 200% of poverty or 300% of poverty, that rise is much smaller in the administrative records than it is in the survey. And so we think this is inconsistent with the notion that there's sudden hardship following retirement. So just to conclude with some caveats, everything we did today only examines incomes of the population 65 and older through 2012. There's going to be a lot of changes as we shift from DB to DC. We cannot easily extrapolate our findings to future retirees. Income also may not capture all relevant aspects of material well-being. In particular, there's outside evidence that debt levels are rising among older households, and if you have to use this higher income to service this debt rather than boost consumption, then maybe we're overstating things somewhat. And then finally, we examined the retirement transitions for abrupt changes around Social Security claiming. We can't use our analysis to ask the question, what happens 20 years after retirement, et cetera. So with those caveats, I'm going to conclude and say thank you, and here's our contacts, and pass it on.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's extremely interesting. Our first discussant today will be Kevin Moore of the Federal Reserve Board.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for organizing this. It's a really interesting session. Let's see if we can get this to move forward. Oop. There we go. Before I get started, so I don't do what Pete did and forget, I'm going to say that the analysis inclusions here are mine and not those of the Federal Reserve Board, the staff, or anybody else at the Federal Reserve banks. So I'm going to give some brief comments on the two papers today. I mean, off the top, they're super interesting to me as a survey practitioner and someone who, in my day job, runs the Survey of Consumer Finances. And so we're always interested to see if there's issues with collecting data from people. And especially Josh and Adam's paper points out that there could be some issues about people reporting their retirement income. And also, as someone who uses the tax data, I'm also interested to see how Pete and his colleagues have really, I think, pushed the envelope on using a lot of the information returns to really bring some good things to bear on their analysis. But I'm going to start out in reverse order here and go with Adam and Josh's paper first. But overall, from the two papers, the headlines are, like Andrew was saying, was that looks like retirement income is higher than many people thought from all the things we hear in the popular press or actually in academic research that has looked at this for a long time. And some of that is due to, it seems like, the data sources may have been not as comprehensive as we thought. So maybe there is no retirement consumption puzzle. And it's because of this administrative data, which has been sort of something that's come on the scenes over the last 15 or 20 years and really been used in a lot of studies these days. And I have to give the hat off to IRS and Statistics of Income for their program of bringing researchers in from the outside to be able to use this data and working with the people at SOI who are super high quality. We've worked with them on the SCF for the last 30 years, and it's been a great relationship. But so it looks like the surveys are missing some of the substantial amount of retirement income, especially the CPS. And what's this mean? Well, it's good news. Measures of poverty for retirees are lower and replacement rates are higher. So it seems like sort of this is it's good news around. It's hard to see what would be bad about that. Just some specifics about the B. and Mitchell paper. So as they said, they point out here when they're looking at the administrative data versus the CPS data, there's the two headline things come out of that is basically this 30% difference in income. I threw in a number from the SCF there, which is similar to the one they gave, but just for the 65 and older. It's 2012, and so you can see our median in the SCF is a little bit lower, so that's a concern. I will say that if, to slightly defend our survey, if you look at the mean, there's a little bit more correspondence with the mean, and our aggregate amount of retirement income we're capturing actually matches up fairly well with it. But that behooves the point that there's still maybe some underreporting at the median that we should focus on. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a second. So what's driving this result? This is the part, as a survey practitioner, that's super interesting to me. And so this chart, sort of from their paper, if you had to look at one chart, I think explains the whole thing in the sense that the retirement income, everything else, when you compare the administrative data to this survey data, it looks pretty good. Retirement income though across the distribution here of household income is just from basically about the 5th percentile all the way out to 95th is 15 to 30% higher, and that's a pretty heavy rate of underreporting. And the interesting thing about that is what's missing, and it's not Social Security. So people, they're getting Social Security, they seem to be able to know that and report it well in these survey and matches the administrative data. But it's the DC and DB retirement plans. And one of the things we've seen over time on the SCF is, I guess, or just on any household survey or any other sort of survey that looks at retirement, is retirement's complicated for people. People, the amount of knowledge people have on it varies drastically. I mean, there's some obviously gradient with age where people that are younger aren't really thinking about retirement, but even those you think are sort of on the doorstep of it seem sort of ill-informed about the choices and resources they have. And here we have a case where people who are supposedly in it and receiving information or receiving income from it are still ill-informed. And I think the interesting thing here is that a lot of this is on the extensive margin for these retirement plans, and so it's basically not that people are not sure how much they're getting because, I don't know, maybe they're telling us something after taxes, or they're thinking about some amount that, they only keep half of it and they have to give their spouse the other half, or something along those lines. But, it's not that. It's that they're not even, reporting that they have it. And it's not just an issue for DC, which, for your IRAs and 401ks, or you may have variable withdrawals, you're not getting a check every month from your former employer, you can understand that somewhat. But it's also an issue for DB plans, they pointed out. And I think that to me was one of the most surprising things about their work, was that I would think for the DB plans it would operate a lot like Social Security. If you're getting a monthly payment, you would remember that and you would know. And so one thing, as a survey practitioner, for me about the variability in the DC income that makes it hard to report, because these are things that people may not even consider it a retirement income. They may think, oh, this is just like taking money out of my savings account. I'm taking money out of my IRA this month because I had some extra expense, or just because I take an extra $1,000 out of there every month or something. So we've thought long and hard about, in our survey, about how we could sort of better capture that. And one of the things we do is we ask about withdrawals from IRAs after we ask about the asset. So right with the asset, we ask how much people have in it, and then we ask about the withdrawals. We don't even wait till later in the survey where we ask about income, because at that point we feel like it's too distant from when we ask about the asset. And we also do that with other type of DC plans. I think that helps us capture a bit more, but again, still not perfect. So I guess if I had any silver lining is for the surveys, would be that if people report it, they're actually getting it fairly well. But the problem is you need to get people to report it. And it's also the case that on the aggregate, as your reporting improves with higher levels of income. So it seems like that's good for capturing the aggregate amount, but it doesn't necessarily help for situation of the median household or households further down the distribution. So moving on to Pete's paper, like I said, or like he spoke of, they use the edited panel, one of the great products that SOI produces and people use for research, sort of just a really, really nice data. They're going to look at individuals aged 55 to 61, and they have data through 2010. So this, again, is examining a period around claiming Social Security. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that really impressed me about this paper was they just sort of went all out on the information returns. And I know that probably caused a lot of pain in terms of linking those together and sort of bringing all those to bear, because I'm sure that everything didn't just match up perfect the first time that they ran the job. Even though the tax data is really good, it's still, there's still always going to be those issues. So it's an impressive use of it, and I think it really points to, to sort of innovations in using the administrative data just beyond the 1040, and I think that's something that they're doing a great work on. And there's also this variety of different measures of income, this concept of the work-related income, and then one thing as a sort of tax policy person I was really happy to see in the paper was they account for this taxes, for the shift in taxation. I mean, you just think about it in general, just it should be painfully obvious that as people, if they're not working and they move out of into retirement, that payroll taxes go away, and that's a big chunk of taxes for a lot of people. And then they do a distributional analysis also. And one of the things you see from this is that Social Security actually is doing its job with these high replacement rates lower in the distribution. And then the takeaway, obviously, is most individuals are able to maintain their level of income. So my sort of takeaway graph from theirs would be one of the box whisker plots they got here showing the replacement rates, and it's really nice to see how that sort of goes out over the income distribution, and how these replacement rates vary even across the top 1% and things like that. So I mean, this is showing around this for this group of people around that time when they're claiming Social Security, it looks like things are looking fairly well in terms of replacement rates. So I mean, I did have a little bit less to say about Pete's paper because it wasn't using the survey data. But I think some of the issues for both papers, and the main one I think just to keep in mind is that this is a great result for the people that are in those cohorts that they're examining. I mean, so and they both the authors are upfront about this, and not claiming that what they're finding in their papers are sort of prediction for the future. They both talked about how those these cohorts have a pretty high incidence of DB and DC. Some would argue they're still in the quote unquote golden age of this coverage where they have both of these types of plans. That's changing fast. I mean, we see that in our data. Coverage for younger cohorts has, been declining in its DC plan. So it's not just going to work every day and putting in your time and getting that, the payout from whatever the formula is. It's actually there's going to be active saving that has to happen, and there's variation in how people are saving. Even if two people work at the same job for 20 years, they could have, vastly different amounts in their IRA or their 401k account at the end of that time because of saving behavior. And so some of these results, I think, we should be basically keeping in our mind that these may not be what the future looks like in terms of whenever the people that are younger today get to that time period. And so one of the things is sort of one of the last things I'll touch on is that because this shift in DC plans is so important, and they've, I think, touched on that too, one of the things we're really focused on in the SCF is obviously household wealth, and one of the things we are trying to better capture is retirement assets, because moving forward, this sort of pile of assets that people have is going to be more important than basically the stream of annuity payments they're getting from some DB plan. And so just as a sort of last thing is just a little takeaway from some work that we have ongoing on measuring retirement wealth, and we're actually trying to make an expanded version of this. We ask a lot of questions about sort of wealth in the SCF, including 401ks, IRAs, and all that sort of stuff. But there are things we miss, and one of them is we don't really ask people to tell us the net present value of their Social Security benefits or defined benefit pension plans, because nobody would know that answer. Not even most economists would have a tough time. Or would divulge into some long discussion about what mortality rates and everything else you should use, and the interview would be 6 hours. But so we're using some other data sources beside the SCF, the CPS, and the Financial Accounts of the United States to sort of allocate Social Security wealth to households and defined benefit pension wealth. And this builds on work that's been done by many other people on the SCF, but also on the HRS, which had focused more on older households. We're going to focus on a little bit younger. But so we just want to know where and how households are amassing retirement resources. So I'll just show you one chart from our sort of work. And so basically what this shows you for two age cohorts, 40 to 49 and age groups 50 to 59 for 3 years from our survey from 89 through 2013. The non-retirement wealth, these first three bars are just everything you'd think of that doesn't include your retirement accounts. And then you can see where the mean sort of wealth is for this group there. And then once you add in sort of DC wealth and then our estimate of DB pensions, you can see this has a pretty decent effect on mean wealth. But then the real sort of kick comes when you add in this sort of net present values of Social Security wealth. And so when you do it for older households, it's what you'd expect. The shift's even greater. And the point of this is basically we know that we're not getting everything whenever we ask people about their wealth and all the resources they have to them. And so our focus here is to build a concept that hopefully we can use to sort of also try to measure adequacy from a sort of a wealth side of things or an asset side of things along with the income side of things. And then one last plug for the SCF is that the results from the 2016 SCF, the public data, the bulletin article will be available at the end of September.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Our second discussant today will be Bruce Meyer at the University of Chicago. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Please refer to this handout. I was a late substitution to discuss 285-page papers. You can think of me as the closer if you want. So these papers are wonderful. The topic is especially important given the magnitude of expenditures on Social Security, given that the modern government is a pension fund that also happens to have an army. I like the papers also because they hit on the fact that the decline in poverty over the last 50 years has been one of the major anti-poverty achievements in the U.S. and the papers, or the B. and Mitchell paper in particular, indicate that decline in poverty has been even greater than indicated by official statistics. I also like the papers because they support much of what I've been arguing for the last 15 years. They fill in large gaps that I haven't been able to fill in. I've been trying to get the Social Security Administration to do a version of this, of the B. and Mitchell paper for about 15 years. Every few years I submit a proposal which gets rejected. And on the other hand, I don't like the fact that I'm now in the age of the study group here. My 20-something kids gleefully reported that not once but twice I got the senior discount on a recent trip. So let me quickly summarize first the B. and Mitchell paper. They find that about half of pension recipients in our main source of income data for our official statistics do not report the pension income they receive. The authors then replace the self-reports of pension and reports of income from some other transfer programs with administrative values from tax and SSA data, and these corrections of the data lead to many remarkable findings. First, the poverty rate of those 65 and older is much lower. Second, the poverty rate falls more over time, though that's not quite how B. and Mitchell sell it. If you look at the figures, the divergence between the survey and the administrative numbers get larger over most of the time and then just narrow a bit at the very end. And one should also emphasize that that's a divergence or pretty much constancy in amount on a much smaller base over time, so that in percentage terms, the reduction is much greater over time. Median incomes of those 65 and older are much higher than we thought when we bring in the administrative data, and median incomes rise much more over time than the survey data alone indicate. The fall in income at retirement is small or non-existent, and there are many other really interesting results. Now, to put these results in context, I want to emphasize that all US surveys are seeing deterioration in their quality. So it's not just pension income that's underreported. Half of SNAP isn't reported in the CPS, half of cash welfare isn't reported. Other work that replaces error-ridden survey reports of certain income components with administrative measures sees similarly large effects. I've emphasized in my work the value of looking at consumption data. If you look at consumption-based measures of poverty that look at what people are actually able to spend on in terms of their housing, food, transportation, and other goods and services, and you find much in the way of similarities between the patterns in the consumption data and those in the corrected income data. The corrected being the ones where the administrative data had been substituted for the error-ridden survey reports. With Jim Sullivan, we've argued that looking at consumption data is conceptually a better way of looking at well-being than reported income. And we conjectured that, and I'll quote our Brookings paper from 2012, the two most plausible explanations for the difference between the changes in income and consumption poverty are measurement error and saving or dissaving. There's considerable evidence that the changes in measurement error are important for families with few resources. First, transfer income, which is particularly relevant for these families, is significantly underreported in surveys, and the extent of this underreporting has grown over time. So there's a lot of similarity with the findings in the papers here. If you look at the figure on the fourth page of the handout, there we've reported consumption poverty measures for men and women over the past 30 years. And you'll see that when you look at the open circles, which are for men, or the open triangles, which are for women, those numbers start to diverge and show lower poverty rates sometime around 1990 or a little later, and the consumption measures show a much greater decline in poverty over time for both men and women. Again, consistent with what B and Mitchell are finding. The next slide there shows a version of this same issue applied not to the aged, but to the overall population. And here we're using data again from the CPS that B and Mitchell used, and we're looking at the effect of underreporting of public assistance, SNAP, which is renamed food stamps, and housing benefits. And when you use the administrative values rather than the survey reports, you find that the poverty reduction for these three programs combined is 90% greater than if you just use the survey reports. And then it differs quite a bit across the programs and combinations of programs that are listed there. So when you account for the underreporting of transfers in the household survey data, the effects of these programs in reducing poverty is much greater. So what are the policy lessons here? The elderly are much better off than they appear. It's important because it may affect where we target future anti-poverty efforts. 2 weeks from now, the Census Bureau will release the poverty report for last year. And at the same time, the Census Bureau will also release a newfangled poverty measure called the Supplemental Poverty Measure that, by some arguments, makes some substantial improvements in how we measure poverty. But it does some things that I think are really mistaken. And it leads to a measure of poverty for the elderly that's much higher than the official rate, and one for children that's much lower. And so this first order thing that this newfangled poverty measure that will be released along with the official measure 2 weeks from now, the first order thing that it does, I think, is wrong, and that's underlined by what B and Mitchell show, that in fact the poverty rate of the elderly is much lower than the official measure because of the underreporting of pension income. Now, even without this correction, we should have known that poverty was especially overstated for the elderly. Almost half of typical spending for a family is housing and transportation. And 80% of those 65 and older already own a home and a car, so that much of the consumption needs are already taken care of, and income isn't needed to maintain a standard of living, as high a standard of living. Moving on to changes in income at retirement, B and Mitchell and Brady et al. Are very complementary. They tell the same story of little or no decline in income at retirement. Each paper uses data that has some advantages vis-a-vis the other paper. The B and Mitchell paper uses a longer history of past earnings, so it's able to get a better measure of what baseline income is, typical income. The Brady et al. Paper accounts for taxes, which is very important since taxes fall a lot in retirement. I do think this literature often goes a little bit awry in focusing on averages and medians. What we really need to get our hands around is what share of people don't have enough to survive on or do well with in retirement. So it's not really a question of means or medians, it's more about what share of people have substantial falls in their standard of living. Now, the Brady et al. Paper finds that there are 10% of people who have a fall of at least 44% 3 years out from the year before retirement. And we know from B and Mitchell that there's already been a fall in income relative to long-term income right prior to claiming. So, so there is a substantial, well, it depends on how you look at it. How much weight do you put on what happens with 10, 20, 5%, depending on how you measure things. And so a caveat here is that probably there should be more research looking at other sources of income for this group, because probably it isn't really 10% that have a fall of 44% or more, because there are income sources that aren't captured in the Brady et al. Data. And so it would be useful to bring in things like SNAP as well, and see, get a more comprehensive picture of the living circumstances of this group, and also I'd argue for looking at consumption, which I think is just a much better way of capturing the living standards of this group, given the durables, houses, cars that people already have. So the general lessons here are also that survey data alone on income is misleading, and that using administrative data by itself or a combination of survey and administrative data goes a long way in solving the problems with the survey data alone. Those at the bottom have more resources than we think, and current institutions, both public and private, reach more of the needy than it appears.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'm cognizant of time here, and I want to make sure I leave enough time for audience questions. So I'm going to jump. I also want to make sure I leave enough time for my question, which is why I'm going to jump straight to it. This may be more for Josh, but certainly Pete, you can weigh in as well. What we have to a certain degree is data points, at a point in time. We know how folks today are doing, and that can't tell us necessarily where people will be in the future, which is one of the policy questions that we face. At the same time, though, there is a perception that since this golden age of traditional pensions, things have been declining. It strikes me, if you've got a pension system, essentially retirement incomes should roughly rise with the same rate of earnings of people pre-retirement. If you had that same rate of increase over time, then you could say that, at least at the mean, that the adequacy of retirement benefits in terms of replacing pre-retirement incomes would stay about the same. Josh, you showed some time series data looking at changes in retirement incomes as measured through the IRS data over time. Do you have some idea how those changes relate to changes in pre-retirement earnings over that same period? In other words, do you have a feeling for the trend over the past couple of decades of how retirement incomes changed relative to the pre-retirement earnings the retirement plans try to replace?
That's certainly something that's research in progress for us, using the longitudinal earnings data for different cohorts and trying to look at least 1 or 2 years into retirement relative to those long-run earning averages. I think if you go back to the start of our series, you can see that the incidence of having any retirement income was much lower. So based on
When you say retirement income, you're meaning retirement income from sort of private retirement
from
plan.
private retirement plans, yes. And so combining that with what Social Security replacement rates used to be, I think we could have some estimate of answering exactly your question. My sense is that living standards are probably more able to be maintained when we look in the early aughts, this kind of period from both our paper and Peter's than what if you looked, say, in 1990 at this pattern. And that might also help explain some of the discrepancies between our paper and the previous literature on the retirement consumption puzzle. So when they were initially writing these papers on whether expenditures fall at retirement, they were looking at people in the PSID, so that's one issue, but that were retiring in the 1980s. And perhaps it was the case then that living standards did change more abruptly at retirement. But given that 61% have some sort of private retirement income now, I would expect that living standards are more able to be maintained now than in the past.
Any thoughts?
Well, I think the first caveat on this is that some of what I'm going to say is based on what I think I know, and a lot of what I thought I know, I wasn't right going in. But we can look to the past research, and I think it's undeniable. People have been getting better off in retirement. Now, a large part of that is we've had an expansion of Social Security. Right? So some people say it's, FDR never meant it to be the only pension plan, and that's fine, but we've had an expansion in the 50s and another expansion in the 70s. It's a much different program. It's designed to be a pension low end, and that's helped a lot. Secondly, a lot of times people impute how many people got pension income from coverage while working. And one of the things that had happened is that before ERISA came in 74, not everyone who was working at a plan, working at an employer and covered by a plan got anything from it. Right? Some of these had vesting of 20 years. Some you had to retire from the plan to get any money at all. If you left a day before normal retirement age, you got nothing. So we actually, in the CPS, to the extent the pattern holds, whether it's correct or not, you do actually see an increase in pension income in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s. It sort of cuts off at 90. And likely a lot of that is due to the fact that not only that the people who were covered by DB actually got something from it, because we had vesting rules, 10-year cliff vesting, tightened to 5-year cliff vesting in 86. So, and then there are studies that have used the HRS and then its precursor, I forget the name of it, and looked at different cohorts and tried to use a comprehensive measure, and they tend to see an increase. Now the question is, we've had a really bad economy for many years now. We seem to see a stalling in this, and the question is that a long-term turnaround, or if we ever recover, will we continue to see the increase go on?
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to open us now up to questions from the audience. We have some folks with microphones. If you could speak into the mic, especially because we have C-SPAN here, and give your name and your affiliation. We have Henry Aaron right here in the front.
Broadly speaking, as I understand it, the 1983 amendments somewhat reduced replacement rates. Over the period since then, the story you've told is that there has been a growth, really, in the amounts of income reported from private pensions of various kinds. Now, over the same period, the pre-retirement income has grown markedly less equal in its distribution. So my question, and it's a statement, but it's a question really, is it not the case that what your story tells is that the retirement system is doing a very good job of extending into retirement the growing inequality that is observed in earnings and other income pre-retirement, so that you're replacing faithfully, and I take that as a takeaway from your two papers, you're replacing faithfully a steadily increasing degree of inequality pre-retirement.
Yeah, I don't think the retirement system is currently set up as, you have progressive Social Security benefit schedule. I think on net, lower income for the combination of taxes and payment out probably get more benefits out of it. But in general, the retirement system is probably not going to counteract things that are happening before retirement, and I think it's designed to try to get a replacement rate, so it wouldn't really have that effect.
Yes, sir.
Carl Pulzer, I'm with a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity. And I first want to thank Bruce Meyer, AEI, for letting me know that SNAP is twice as effective in reducing poverty than we thought based on administrative data. I thought I would have had to go to the Center on Budget for that. But my question is, one of my jobs is to look into the future for the long-term care industry and, look at their finances and demand and supply. And you say you're looking as Henry said, in the past, 10, 20, 30 years from now, given what you observed about the transition from DB to DC, can you be an actuary? Just pretend. What can you tell me? Is it going to be 25%, still more income from this administrative data, or it's going to be a wider variation? What can I tell my client, based on this transition?
The SEF might be the best data source we have on this right now. But
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what we're sort of, for the SCF, when we're collecting sort of wealth data, we're trying to look at the resources that people would have available, and maybe there's some way to sort of take those resources for people at retirement and sort of do this sort of projection out to say, how are people going to do if they have this pot of money to spend? I mean, one of the things that's problematic about it is, there's sort of issues of internal control for people, because as you get to the fact DC plans and they have to manage this, right? And so how do they manage that given health shocks, given any other kind of shocks that happen, right? I mean, there's probably a fair amount of people out there that you could say that they'd be better off annuitizing all of their wealth at retirement to save them from themselves. But that's necessarily not going to happen. But I think what we're trying to do is get an idea of all the sort of resources people would have at retirement with this sort of expanded measure we're trying to get at, and then we can look at things like how they could potentially stretch this out across lifespans using things like mortality rates and things like that. So it's a difficult question. I mean, it's fraught with a lot of assumptions about what's going to happen. But I mean, I think the biggest piece of what you're asking is that the shift to DC is going to, unfortunately, increase the uncertainty on that.
Well, let me make a few comments. I think, first of all, economists are good at analyzing data that exists and telling you what happened. We're less accurate at forecasting. But there's a few things. One is this, there seems to be opinion that everyone retired with a gold watch and a pension. Okay? The fact of the matter is all types of pensions have certain risks. The traditional defined benefit final average pay actually have a lot of risks in that the benefits are terribly backloaded. So you not only have to work for a company for a long time to get it, you have to retire, you have to leave the company close to normal retirement age, because a lot of these are set nominally. And so the idea that everyone, particularly low-income people, had a whole lot of money from DBs. Right? So someone who's long tenured and retires from an employer is not a definition of a low-income person. I mean, no matter what their job is, they're probably at least middle income. Right? So we don't know what's going to happen. There's certainly risks on all sides. There are things that we might think are better about it, particularly for lower income people, to the extent that, and women who tend to more likely to move in out of the workforce, that you have this, you build it ratably over time, it's not as backloaded, and we don't know. The other thing you can look at is actually what's going into these things, and I think, so certainly there may have been some windfalls from defined benefits, that people were getting benefits that were never actually funded, right? But as far as money going into the plans, you're looking at, combined with employer contributions, employee contributions, close to 11% of pay going into DC plans. And I don't think we've ever had that going into a defined benefit plan. So we don't know what the future is going to be. I don't have a crystal ball. There's certainly uncertainty. But the assumption that we're going from a perfect world to an imperfect world, where there are two imperfect worlds, there's lots of risks, and it's very uncertain what's going to happen. But when you look at the data, you look at those who are right near retirement, we've had a shift from what type of plan they have. We haven't really had a shift in how many people have it, at least near retirement. We're starting to, the recession caused some problems for younger people, but near retirement, about 80% of households have this income, that working households. And there has been other research, certainly with the HRS, where you look, Gusman, Steinmeier, and Tabatabai, where they try to measure this, and you do see a shift in wealth from DB to DC, but you actually aren't seeing much of a decline overall in the benefits. But it's uncertain. I can't tell you what's going to happen in 20 years.
Thanks. Yes, please.
My name is Emily Marino, and my question is what the Puerto Rico Oversight Board doing right now just another union Chrysler bailout?
Is that directed at Andrew?
That would be directed at me. My day job is at AEI. What I thought was going to be a part-time job, it turned out to be more than part-time, was with the federal government's Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. And the question is whether this would be similar to a Chrysler bailout. Puerto Rico is facing significant financial problems at this point. The board I'm on has no federal resources that we can put into Puerto Rico. So even if we're inclined to bail them out, we are not able to. And I'll say we are not inclined in the sense that I think there's a unanimous feeling on the board that Puerto Rico needs to make structural changes to things such as pensions, but a whole variety of areas to make the island sustainable and economically growing over the future. So the short answer is no, there will be no bailout, unless you could talk to Congress if they're inclined to do it, but I'm not sure that's going to happen.
I just had one quick follow-up to that. So in all of these cases, there's secured debt and then there's unsecured debt. And with Chrysler and both Puerto Rico, the unsecured debt includes that of the pension funds. In the case of Puerto Rico, the Constitution, which passed through Congress twice, specifically states that the general obligation debt is the most senior and most secure. In Chrysler, the case in which what happened was the 55% of the new company stock went to the unsecured debt, while the secured debt got crammed down to accept a payment of 23 cents on the dollar. Conservatives and free market thinkers, such as AEI, were staunchly opposed to the Obama bailout of the UAW. So my question is, how is this not the same? And as someone representing the oversight board that has allowed the government to pay 100% of the pension funds, how can you side with this? As
I'll be very quick, because this is off topic, and you're going to lose most of the viewers on this who know nothing about Puerto Rico. The board has instituted pretty dramatic changes to the pension system. There'll be about a 10% overall cut in pension benefits, along with large cuts in healthcare spending, a whole range of other things. So there is nobody on the island, and no stakeholders on the island, be it pensioners, be it citizens, be it creditors, who are not making significant sacrifices. Other questions? Oh, sure, right there. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm Bobby Pestronk, just a citizen of the U.S. interested in
Nobody's just a
the
citizen.
issue of retirement. First, I want to compliment the panel on the presentations that were made, which were understandable to a lay person. Nice job. I have a question about the work that may be shortly underway in Congress to change taxes and other benefits that may be available, and whether you can talk about the effect of what might happen, depending upon political perspective, on the kind of findings that you have right now, how that might affect.
Are you
people
speaking
in
about
retirement.
changes, say, shifting 401ks or pensions to a Roth basis, where taxes are paid up front? It's not. It wasn't clear to me what tax changes you're referencing.
Well, I think that there are a range of potential changes, and I guess today or sometime shortly we're about to hear what changes in tax policy are going to be presented by the administration. I'm talking about both potential benefits that are available to people at different levels of income, and changes in the way in which the taxes may be applied to people at different levels of income.
Josh, Pete, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a very broad topic, and I certainly am not going to volunteer what's going to happen. I don't want to suggest something I don't want to happen, that's for sure. I will say I have a book on the tax treatment of pensions and potential, a lot of proposals that have happened in the past and how they affect the tax treatment. I might refer you to that. And I have some short blogs that, so you don't have, if you don't want to read a 200-page book, they're short blogs that sort of describe some of the issues. So I might point you to that. But I certainly don't want to volunteer what might happen, particularly if it's something I don't want.
Josh is not looking eager here.
I'm going to stick to measurement.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Christina Fitzpatrick with AARP, and Pete, I have a question for you. There's a lot in here in both papers that are very interesting and challenge a lot of the assumptions a lot of us have. I'm looking at the graphs for the lowest income quintiles, and in those you're saying that not only at the median is the replacement rate not going down, but it's actually going up. And what intuitively, how do we understand that?
So we also show that the increase is primarily among those who continue to work after claiming Social Security. For those who are no longer working, it's a slight increase, but it's not as big. So economists have a danger of, we like reading these tables and we've formed stories around them, so I don't want to go too far out on the limb. But from looking at the data, one thing that seems to be occurring that conditional on continuing to work, those in the lowest quintile 99 income don't have a very large reduction in earnings, whereas the rest of the higher parts of the income distribution, even those who continue to work, you see a decline in their at least mean earnings and median earnings. So what it suggests to me is that some at the bottom who are very low income may be using this as a wage supplement. Maybe they were perhaps liquidity constrained. It's a boost to resources and they're using it to increase their income. Maybe they could have used it before they claimed Social Security, but we don't have such plans in place. So I don't want to read too much into a table of numbers, the means and medians and incidents, but certainly it looks like those at the bottom who continue to work are behaving differently than at the top. They tend to maintain, if they continue to work, they're making pretty much what they're making before, and then they're adding some additional income.
People who aren't continuing to work, they're still saying they're staying at, there is no
Yes.
decline
At the median, yes.
at the median. So how is that? And how is that if they're not working, they're just getting Social Security?
Well, so a lot of them have other sources. So what we showed, about 25% in the bottom, 20% are only relying on Social Security. But you also have to know that the Social Security system has a very progressive benefit structure. So for a lower earner, you are actually replacing over 100% of your average lifetime earnings, inflation adjusted. Not wage adjusted, but inflation adjusted. So there's very high replacement rates at the very bottom. They're getting high replacement rates of Social Security, but they also have access to, there are some that have pensions and they have other income. So it's.
So, sorry, one more question. So is all this inflation adjusted, not wage?
Everything's inflation adjusted. Well, the replacement rates are inflation adjusted. So we're talking about inflation adjusted income in T+1 compared to the income before retirement.
I mean, over the periods you're looking at, a wage adjustment wouldn't make much of a difference.
Oh, no,
It's only
no.
a few years.
No, what I was talking about is normally when people talk, at the bottom of the formula is 90% of wage adjusted lifetime earnings, but it turns out that, at least historically, and we hope it happens in the future, wages have grown faster than inflation. And so if, as a percent of what they actually earned in real terms, you're actually replacing a much higher percentage.
I'd just add
Sure.
one thing that Pete's paper does that's great is the taxes are in there too. And so you have to understand that the payroll tax going away for those people that aren't working is going to be huge, and the fact that their Social Security is not going to be taxed. So their tax, so their sort of net of the tax bill goes down, and that I think helps also with it.
I'm glad you read it more recently than I have, because yes, I forgot.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about it, if you had somebody who's in the 90% replacement factor at the very low end, but they're losing the Social Security Medicare payroll tax, which is 7.65%, and they're not paying taxes in retirement, you're getting close to 100% right there. Sir, yes, in the middle?
Yeah, hi. I'm Ted Goldman, Senior Pension Fellow at the American Academy of Actuaries. So there is an actuary in the room. My question gets back to this growing problem of converting savings into lifetime income. And could it be one explanation, Peter, for T+3 is that people draw down enough assets to maintain their same standard of living, but if you were to continue your study and look at T10 and T20, we may see marked reductions in people's ability to maintain standard of living. So it's good news that people have saved enough to last 3 years, but do we know anything beyond that?
Yeah, so from my paper, I can't say anything beyond 3 years, but I can tell you about work that we have done with the data. So first of all, although we used T+3 in the paper, so part of this is a trade-off, right? So the further we look out, the fewer people we can look at, right? So we basically said, you know, what happens if we look 2 years out, 3 years out, 4 years out, 5 years? So we've looked at those. There isn't a huge difference, and actually we've done sensitivity analysis if we look further back. Those don't seem to change it. The other thing we did do is we followed each cohort in '99 and looked at the percentage that had pension income afterwards. Now the problem with that, so we looked at other age ranges other than 55 to 61. So we'll look at people who are 70 in '99, people who are 60 to 70 in '99, and so forth. Now the problem with that is I'm pretty sure the 55 to 61-year-olds who are working, the tax data is representative of the whole sample. Non-filers aren't really an issue. I don't know that for the other groups. So I can't tell you who's not filing. But among those who were initially filing in '99 of those age groups, and we look out, the percentage that have pension income is not falling off. You know, so if we follow people for 10 years in all these different cohorts, and you line them up as sort of synthetic cohort that you would use, it's basically, it goes up and it doesn't really go down. Now, again, I'm not sure how representative those other groups are because I don't have the non-filers, and I think non-filing goes up as you age, for example. But nothing I can see in the data suggests it's going away, but I can't, just from the analysis I've done, rule it out, certainly.
Because you don't know how much wealth they have accumulated, right?
The only thing we can look at is IRA wealth from the Form 5498, but we can't look at DC wealth, we can't look at, we don't know DB wealth, and other things. And we don't know any other taxable wealth. We just have the income flows.
Josh, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we also have the same problem with the data ending in 2012, so we can't do our synthetic cohort many years into the future. But when we do look in the cross-section, right, when the main results I presented, the 85 plus group did have substantial boosts in income relative to the survey. And in fact, the poverty rates were only somewhat higher for the 85 plus than for the 65 to 74. So obviously that's mixing cohorts and ages, but that evidence there is consistent with a relatively high ability to maintain some absolute living standard.
I think for the questions you're thinking about, you might want to look at work done with consumption data, something like Mike Hurd and Suzanne Roetter from RAND, who use the HRS CAM survey. There's some work with SCF. I mean, the interesting thing in the survey consumer finances, if you look at older retirees where you'd think, okay, these are the folks who are running out of money, you would expect they would cut back substantially on discretionary expenditures, gifts to people, charitable contributions, things like that. You don't really see it. I think the Hurd and Roetter work, which follows individual households over time using the HRS, doesn't find that many people are running out of money. Other questions? Oh, sure.
My name is Monique Morrissey. I'm with the Economic Policy Institute, and I want to congratulate a very interesting panel. I really appreciate it. Both papers are very interesting. My question is, well, first of all, a quick question for Joshua Mitchell is, you mentioned at the end of your paper that you are looking at the post-2014 redesign of the CPS, and it's ambiguous in the language whether you're actually going to do the similar exercise or whether you're just talking about how to fix the questions to better capture the retirement income. And I would just, for those of us who are sort of stuck with using the CPS and want to make corrections for the CPS data post-2014, I would very much appreciate it if you repeated the exercise with administrative data for 2014 and afterwards. But the other question I have is actually for both you and Kevin Moore is, I know this is very speculative, but the most surprising thing about the paper is how much the DB income is underreported. DC income we knew was underreported, and for obvious reasons. But DB income, I mean, Kevin Moore also mentioned that it was surprising. And just if you have any idea at all why it is that it's so underreported, given that it's a steady source of income.
So we've looked into this in terms of checking if these DB withdrawals are one-time or consecutive, and they really do seem to be steady payments, as you say. So it's a bit of a puzzle. We've tried to explain it in terms of demographic groups and so on, and we don't find much there. I think the standard explanations for survey underreporting may apply here, such as fatigue. When the questions get asked in the order of questions, people may be ready to end the interview. Also, some notions about what is income. People may view this as sort of, oh, I earned this during my working life, and so they're just not viewing it the way we would as income. That's another potential issue. And then lastly, I know that from some other surveys, there's this finding that people tend to report their income better when they actually turn around and spend that income. So for example, if you just get a distribution and it just goes into your savings account, and this could be DB or it could be DC where you have a required minimum distribution, and just goes from one account to another, you might forget to report that as income for the survey because you didn't spend it that year or that period.
So, Katie, I may come out about one of the things I knew going into this is that we covered DB pension income well, but not DC pension income, and I knew all the explanations for that. I've never been satisfied with that explanation, and someone who does the survey can explain it better to me, but I've never been surveyed. But if you just read the survey questions, the first question literally says, do you receive any payments of anything other than Social Security? And part of the things that includes is including profit sharing plans. Now, many people may not know this, but 96% of profit sharing plans are 401k plans and vice versa. So the regular payment item was never brought up until the second question, which was, what is the source of this? And then regular was an option. So, we've done a lot of studies. I mean, we've done comparisons of the cross-sectional data, of the universe, of the CPS. We're writing it up. Now that Josh's paper came out, maybe some of the things won't be as shocking, but we find many of the same things. And it can't just be the DC that it's underreporting. It's just not big enough. It seems to be regular payments. And then what Josh's paper shows is that back in 1990, when there weren't a lot of DCs, we were underreporting this. Okay, so we are measuring this badly, and I don't know if we really know why we're measuring it badly. And let me just put a little caveat on trying to separate this into DB and DC. I would really like to separate this into DB and DC. It's really hard to do with the tax data. I think they have an interesting way to do it. However, I think since there are many things I knew, I don't want to leap to a new thing that I know that really isn't true. And so I think some humility is needed, that we don't really know exactly where this is coming from, and we can try different ways to get at it. But until it's important for the tax authority to track whether it's a DB or DC, as much as policymakers would want it, it's going to be hard to figure this out. And I think I like going to specific plans, and that we can try to narrow it down and identify it. I think we can do some work and identify it. But just a little caution on what's DB and what's DC. I don't think we really know. And we don't even know what's non-qualified annuity payments.
Well, I apologize. We're going to have to call time now, and I want to thank all of you for coming today. And of course, I want to thank all of our speakers and discussants who did such a fantastic job. I'm hoping our speakers and discussants will be willing to stay around for a few minutes afterwards and to answer any questions that we didn't get to during the event. Thank you all for coming to AEI today. Because I've been comparing the cross section, but we can't.
Oh, sure. Okay. We can see.
But I would find the same thing. It's the median amount and the average amount conditional on receiving is actually not bad.
Not bad.
It's just they don't have enough people receiving it. Oh, hi. Oh, nice to meet you.